meeting in order?
And lady.
Well, no, I'm talking to these two.
You're on the...
We're ready. I'm ready.
Okay. We call this meeting on June 13, 2016 of the Public Hospital District Number 4, King County Board of Commissioners to open. Just do the roll call, please, now.
President Norris?
Here.
Vice President Young?
Here.
Secretary Spikers?
Here.
Commissioner Herron?
Here.
Commissioner Pollard?
Here.
Thank you.
Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move we approve the agenda.
I second it.
We have can you hear, gentlemen, that we are approving the agenda?
Yes, yes, I can hear.
Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any that oppose? Okay, then that passes. New business. The new business is Resolution 509-0616, approving a first supplement to the trust indenture dated July 2nd, 2015. So who would like to go forward? Would you like to do this, Brad?
Yeah, this is Steve. I'm going to have Brad start off and talk about the trust indenture agreement, the covenants, what they are. We've got a few slides showing where we are currently, and then Brad will then take over again and talk about next steps.
Okay.
So what I'd like to do first is just provide a little bit of background to place this in context. As you all know, about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, the revenue bonds were issued. And the primary document for the revenue bonds is what's called the trust indenture. And that's basically a contract between the district as the borrower and the bondholders, who are the ones that provided the money. And that document contains a number of provisions, the most basic requirement being that you pay the principal and interest when it's due. And then there are some covenants, and the covenants, for the most part, are designed to provide some additional protection to the bondholders. And one of those covenants is what we call the coverage requirement. And the essence of a coverage requirement is simply to show that the district is generating enough revenue on an ongoing basis to pay the debt service that's due on the bonds, the principal and interest that's due. And in your particular case, as is typical, the coverage requirement says we want to make sure that you're generating enough money not only to pay the principal and interest, but also to provide a little bit of cushion. And so the coverage requirement is set at 120% of the debt service. So in other words, it needs to show that you're covering not only 100% of debt service, but another 20% cushion. And the reason for that is simply to provide an early warning that if you're not generating enough, certain things would happen. And in this case, what happens if you don't meet that requirement is that the indenture requires that you hire a consultant to come in and advise the district what changes could be made in terms of your operation to increase the likelihood that in the future you would meet the coverage requirement. It's not a default under the bond indenture, so there's no other action that the bondholders can take, but it does require the additional step of hiring the consultant. Now, there are two ways in which coverage requirements can be expressed. One way is to simply compare the revenue that's generated in a given year, in this case 2015, to the amount of debt service that's actually payable in that same year, in 2015. A stricter approach, one that potentially provides more protection to the bondholders, is not to compare it to the debt service in that particular year, but to compare it to the highest amount of debt service that is due while the bonds remain outstanding. So in other words, you look at every single year on a going forward basis, and you find the year in which the total amount of principal and interest is highest, and that's what you compare it to, rather than just looking at what's due in that particular year. When these bonds were structured about this time last year, the bond indenture originally based the coverage requirement on annual debt service. And it included a specific exception when you look at annual debt service for a particular year to exclude any portion that was paid from the proceeds of the bonds. In other words, if you didn't have to use revenue to pay the debt service, then you didn't have to count that amount of debt service. And the way these bonds were structured is, in the first year of 2015, the amount that you borrowed was sufficient not only to cover the overall project, but also to pay the first interest payment that was due in December 2015. So that was paid from the proceeds of the bonds. It didn't have to be paid from the revenue that was generated from the operation of the hospital. So if the coverage requirement were based on annual debt service, then that debt service in 2015 gets ignored. You basically have no debt service in 2015 because 100% is paid from the proceeds of the bonds. When the bonds were marketed in that final week, the potential bond purchasers said that if they were going to buy the bonds, they wanted to change the test from basing it on annual debt service to maximum annual debt service, because that's a sort of standard way to provide a little bit more protection. In your case, with the exception of the first year, there's not much difference between the annual debt service each year and maximum annual debt service, because the debt service throughout the term of the bonds is almost level. So it's not a situation in where there are big jumps in terms of debt service that might be due. Sometimes bonds are structured that way, where you might have lower principal interest in the early years, and then it ratchets up over time. And in that case, using maximum annual debt service would make a difference. In your case,
Brad, the only thing that's changing is significantly through the term is the portion of debt or interest versus principal.
Correct, and that's just like a home mortgage where you have level payments on your mortgage. What's happening in order to have level principal and interest is, over time, the interest goes down, principal goes up, the combination of the two is equal. And that's basically the way your bonds are structured. But there wasn't an exception that was included in the indenture when we moved to maximum annual debt service to exclude the first year that was payable from the proceeds of the bond. And so the way the indenture reads right now is, you look at maximum annual debt service, and that goes to a year in which it's the highest amount, which in your case happens to be 3034, and that's the debt service that you have to use under the current language. And there's no exception for the fact that in the first year, the principal, or actually the interest, was payable from the proceeds of the bonds. The only consequence of that is, again, you're not in default as a result of that. It's just that you trigger this requirement to hire a consultant. If you did that, the consultant would simply come in and say, well, this is really a one-time event. It's actually an event that was anticipated when the bonds were issued, which is why the interest was payable from the proceeds of the bonds, and that would be sort of the extent of their report, and that would be the end of it. But it seems like a waste of effort to go through that process, because it's not going to give you anything of value.
It'll cost us money.
That's correct.
Okay.
And as a result, what is proposed in this resolution is that we amend the definition of maximum annual debt service to specifically carve out the years in which the principal and interest is payable from the proceeds of the bonds. And if that's done, then you won't trigger the need to bring in the consultants. And the amendment process under the indenture is, it specifically permits amendments, and it requires that you get the approval of not less than 50% of the bondholders based on the principal amount of bonds that they own. In this particular case, the bonds were purchased by a relatively small number of purchasers. We don't have the final numbers at this point in terms of who owns what now. We know from when they were originally sold. But we think it's possible that it's maybe only 2, possibly 3 purchasers that would have to agree to the amendment. So that if you were to approve this resolution and authorize the amendment, then that would be the next step. And there's a process under the bond indenture that provides for getting the approval of the bondholders. And if
Have you already checked with them in a preliminary way as to whether they would accept the?
Not yet, and the reason is because we have to be careful not to disclose any non-public information, and so we didn't want to have any discussions with the bondholders until we had this meeting, and the board decided whether it wanted to go down that road, and then if that happens, then we'll have the conversations. If you decide not to do it, then there wouldn't be any conversations about
But
it.
if we decide to do it, we would not have to bring in a consultant.
Correct.
And there would be no cost to us.
Correct. That's right.
What trigger and who caused this to be amended and when?
Well, it depends on what you mean by amended. When the bonds,
The resolution to now what we are approaching this decision.
what we're proposing to do now,
Yes. What trigger? It would not have happened if it were not for what?
the fact that if this language had been included in the original indenture, then it would not be necessary to amend it now to insert the language.
Okay. So when was it written and discovered that there was some
When did we
missing?
sell the bonds? Last summer?
Right.
Yeah,
It was in July.
It was in
July.
July of 2015.
So it probably was written, a couple months before. I think it
Should have been caught then, so that would trigger this.
Yeah,
Right.
as I mentioned, in the original form, it was based on annual debt service as opposed to maximum annual
Maximum
debt
annual.
service. And as long as that had been there wouldn't have been an issue.
Yeah.
The insertion of the maximum annual debt service was inserted just before the board approved the final resolution during that week, a few days before. And that happened because the process when bonds are underwritten is that you in effect go out with a proposal to potential bond purchasers with certain covenants, and then you get their reaction to it. And in this case, the potential bond purchaser said, we're willing to buy the bonds, but we want you to make this change. We want you to base it on maximum annual debt service rather than average annual debt service. And we didn't have a chance to run the numbers to confirm that, in fact, in the first year, that potentially would create a problem depending on how much revenue you generated in the first year. And Steve will go through the numbers here, but the basic issue is the fact that obviously the bonds were issued halfway through the year. That's about when the new hospital began operating. So you got the benefit of increased revenue for only 6 months rather than 12 months, but you're comparing it in terms of debt service, the debt service for a full 12 months, as opposed to...
Would you say that this was a technical oversight on the part of the parties?
Yes.
And therefore, and then would you perhaps predict whether this is the kind of thing that bondholders are likely to recognize as a technical adjustment and
Yes.
therefore not cause a problem?
Correct. Because there's really no benefit to them to insist upon the existing provision, bringing in a consultant who's simply going to say, this is a one-time event, there's nothing that needs to change, and it's just sort of a waste of everybody's time to do that.
And money.
Correct. That's right. That's right.
It's not money.
Yep.
And money.
So with that, I think it probably would, it's a little bit more meaningful probably to see actual numbers to sort of understand how these covenants work. And so,
Okay.
Steve, you want to go through that?
Yeah, let's go through all 3 covenants we have. We meet 2, and I'll point out the one that's the issue. The first one is the days cash on hand. At the end of 2015, we had 92.59 days cash on hand. The requirement is 50, so we met that. Okay. The next one is a reserve fund, and we funded a reserve fund for $3.675 million, and it was funded, so that was it. The next one is the issue. The issue is, this is a calculation of our debt service coverage, and using the maximum annual debt service, which is $3.675 million in 2034. Okay. We meet the minimum. If this was a zero, in other words, we have to have income. We have enough income to cover it. But we're below 1.2. So we would be required to call in and engage a consultant. I have talked to Ide Bailey and said, what would you charge for this? And I got this, it was somewhere between 5 and 15,000. So if you average it, about 10. Probably 10 is a good number. So what you'd be looking at is an expense of $10,000 to come in and say,
Tell us
yeah,
what we need to do different, right?
yeah,
And
and
make improvements?
I'm talking to the consultant, Ross Manson, who's familiar with this. He said, well, what I'd really do is come in, we'd reforecast your 2016, see where you were, and if you're doing fine, and I'll have another slide on that, we'd probably say, yeah, you're fine, no changes required. So here's where we are through April on those 3 covenants. And that's a question. So reserve fund, we still have $3.675 million in the reserve fund. We're not going to touch that. We can't touch it. Debt service coverage through April, we're 1.53. It exceeds by quite a bit the target of 1.2. Days cash on hand, we have 88.8, and exceeds the requirement of 50 days cash on hand. So we are meeting those covenants as we have met them all year. So that's where we are. So you could anticipate, I mean, the consultant would say, yeah, you're meeting them, here's your bill. You know, and he'd talk about ongoing programs. We have some programs that actually will improve things we've talked about. One is benchmarking, we talked about that, and that the productivity study that we've had done in our ED, med-surg, and rehab departments. Those will improve that number going forward. So we're taking steps strategically to actually improve these outcomes. So any questions on that? I've talked to you
I
with
have
all
quite a
individually.
few.
Yeah, okay, David.
First of all, how did this issue come to fruition? Why did it come up?
We did, I'll tell you, we did the audit, and we were looking at the interpretation of the covenants written in the trust indenture agreement, and well, that doesn't sound, it was different from what I had seen, and I probably missed that last iteration, and talked to legal counsel, talked to the investment banker, and talked to our CPA, said, no, that's the way it is, and we got some clarification on it. That's how it came up.
And then Brad mentioned, quote, we had not had a chance to run the numbers. Who's we?
We had hired a CPA firm, Ide Bailey, to run the numbers. In that number was a forecast of 2015, and that was not updated. It could be.
Are you saying that Ide Bailey?
Ide Bailey and I did not pick it up, David.
I'm just trying to figure out having Brad's hourly rate tied into this resolution is going to be, I'm sure, $4,000 or $5,000. Are we
No, I'm
liable to pay
not,
this or what?
David, I'm not going to charge for any of my time in connection with this.
Okay. Well, that makes me feel much better because that's how I do things at my law firm. If I make a mistake, I usually just go keep everybody happy, keep their business.
That's what we do.
So appreciate that. So that was the biggest thing. And then there was this $10,000 that would, have to go through this to hire a consultant. When you kind of made it simplified into like 3 different things, like meeting the maximum debt service, days cash on hand, and something else. You mean tell me somebody would charge $10,000 to proclaim that these were met, these 3 items?
David, that's the range I was given. I did not argue with it. I just wanted to know a relative number to speak about. So there was...
No, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. I'm just trying to think of if you had to bring an outside consultant in. They're charging $10,000 for this. It seems like it'd be a little bit more detail in what they're looking at, and I just want to make sure that the issues that we are addressing are all of the issues that need to be addressed, so that we don't down the line end up with a situation that where we're perhaps not at default, but triggering another outside consultant issue.
If you recall, we watch it every month in the Finance Committee, and last month, for instance, we looked at days cash on hand and we looked at debt service coverage. So we are watching that monthly.
No, we're doing good there. That's not it. What I'm trying to figure out, why would they charge $10,000 if these are the main items that they would look at and say, hey, everything's okay?
What you're saying is that there are other ratios that they would.
Right. See,
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to, exactly, Tom.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, that, are there other issues out there that we're not aware of in this conversation that maybe, I'm just trying to be conservative on what we are looking at, you know, and is something else going to come up that we don't know about that, so.
If the consultant were charged with this work, that they would have to come in and independently verify all of the source information used in order to calculate those ratios. It would almost be like a mini audit.
Okay.
I suspect that's where the cost comes from.
Okay.
Them doing it independently and verifying a lot of that.
Well, that makes sense, because I was trying to figure out 10,000
Keep it
and,
open,
okay.
public meeting.
You understood what I was trying to get at, okay. Those are the questions that I had.
Yeah.
Thank you.
David, just to clarify, when you bring in a consultant, which would be a CPA firm, they're putting their license on the line, so they're going to have to go through a certain level of due diligence. So it will cost you more than you think it should.
I think David had some good points. The bottom line to me is, are we facing future surprises like this?
Yes, good question, Gene. That's kind of what I was trying to get at in the bottom line. You know, are we gonna
David was worried
basically
about
think,
the consultant cost, and that was my chief concern, and I think Brad's generosity here is very much appreciated since this is a public institution. Thank you very much. But I want us to forestall future surprises and costs.
We are looking at it in detail every month going forward.
we do.
We have an annual budget process. We're going into strategic planning. So I think, and we're looking at some programs to make ourselves more efficient. So my answer to you is we are being very diligent in trying to avoid what you call future surprises, and we will continue to.
So it's in our hands, is what I think Gene's trying to say. It's in our hands whether things go wrong or good.
Right.
And not so much as what has already been created.
Right.
In this, okay?
Yeah, and it's in the hands
That's what he's trying.
of staff and board working together, you know, really. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And
We just, that's all we were trying to get at. Is there something we don't know about that, you know, we should be worried about as potential surprise down the line, other than what we're looking at month to month and practically day to day, you know, on the staff side, looking at things. So that's all I'm trying to get at.
Okay.
And I think Gene hit it on the nail, or hit the nail on the head. Is, you know, is there something else that we need, because, you know, obviously we're doing, you know, we're doing our due diligence, and we will be doing planning and whatnot. So that I'm not concerned about. What I'm concerned about is there something else, and my understanding there is not.
there is
Correct?
not. What you always worry about is, as Donald Rumsfeld said, the unknown unknowns. So.
Well, yeah, I understand, but there's nothing in the bonds that we need to be concerned about down the line, other than what the plain language that we understand today.
Other covenants.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And not that we know of.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've been covered.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think that's my questions that I think have been answered. I appreciate that from all of you.
And Brad, you pretty much covered next steps, but do you want to?
Well, let me get into the actual resolution now, and it, as I described earlier, the only thing it does is alter one definition in the indenture. So it provides some background similar to what I've described in terms of why you're considering doing this, but the actual language of the amendment is in section 3, and what's double underlined is language that's being added that's not currently in there. And what that does is it excludes from the calculation of maximum annual debt service, any portion of the debt service that is payable from some source other than income or revenue. So in other words, if not only the first year where you borrowed money and used that to pay interest, you exclude it because it's not being paid from revenue. If you were ever to do that again, if there were some future construction project and you borrowed money to pay the principal, then you'd be able to exclude it there. So this provides a potential benefit not only looking back to 2015, but also in the future, recognizing that these bonds will be outstanding for a number of years, and so you want to create as much flexibility as possible. So that's why it's drafted to cover not only the last year, but also future years.
Okay, Rodney, do you have any particular concerns about anything that's been said here today in this resolution itself?
No, I mean, and I want to preface my comments, I'm not bond counsel, so this is
Right,
outside of my expertise, but, you know, in terms of the actual language, I think that it solves the problem of the first year calculation of the debt, which is what we needed to do. So I think it.
So your recommendation is for the board to approve this?
Before we
Well,
approve.
Wait,
Oh,
we're
sorry.
still
My,
in the meeting.
so my recommendation is that it's necessary to do it, absolutely.
And therefore, on the basis that it's necessary and there's no objection, yes, we should
Yeah, absolutely,
recommend approval.
absolutely. Yep.
Okay, Emma, I'm okay, but I'd like to add section 8 to the section 7, after section 7, to say, or to read, cost of resolution. The district shall not pay any of the costs related to the resolution.
I don't
Is
think-
that necessary? I don't.
No, I don't think it's
Well,
necessary. Brad's
because
already,
if you were to, I know, but we are paying also the consultant.
No, we won't.
No. We won't be paying that.
We will not be paying that.
this avoids it.
This avoids the payment of that cost.
We don't have to do the consultant if
Yeah.
we do this.
If we do.
I think that what we want to have is something in writing somewhere that says we're not, we've all agreed. That's all. It doesn't have to be in the resolution, but we need to have it somewhere, either in the minutes of the meeting or something, and that way we can look back if something does come up.
Yeah, that's good. I think it goes in the
That's
minutes.
fine.
Oh, okay.
And I think that Emma has I think that's, to have it in writing, I think, I didn't know if there were, if everyone was going to agree to that or not, and so everyone seems to be in agreement, and if we have it in the minutes,
Yep.
and it does
David
come up,
Bell-
then we can say, hey, there was an agreement here.
Right, yeah, and Val's already got it in the minutes, David, so we're good there.
Okay.
David, it's
Okay.
being recorded
Does that-
as well.
Does that help, Emma?
Yes, that's
I
fine.
think that would help. I think that would be the best way to do it, that it's clean
Concrete.
on its surface here for presentation to the bondholders.
Okay, is there any more discussion on this?
I was going to ask you to recognize, to make the same point, and I'm comfortable with
Wait,
this.
Jean, may I ask you to wait, because I want to make sure Joan hasn't said anything, so I'd like to give her an opportunity first, and then and then I don't, do you have any comments,
I
Joan?
don't have any comments. I think it was very prudent to come up with this solution, and I think it's put together in a very concise manner, and we should approve it.
Thank you, Joan. Jean?
I was just going to make a similar point to what David stated, and I believe, number one, the recording and the minutes should suffice to make the written record that Mr. Spikers was, and I think all of us were concerned about. So, and I would just like to also recognize that human errors will happen.
Yeah.
This was a minor human error, I think, not having foreseen this potential problem, and I think all is forgiven. And I really appreciate the way that Brad and Steve have worked together to find this successful resolution that cost the district nothing.
I agree with Jean. I think that this is a good resolution. I appreciate that Brad, you and your company are willing to take care of this for us, and that shows integrity, at least for me, and I think for the board, so we do appreciate that. Next, we need public comment before we can make any vote. Am I doing this right?
Mhm.
Okay. Is there any public comment? No. Seeing as there is no public here, I assume there's going to be, not going to be public comment, but we went through the procedure just because we needed to. Okay. We are going to move on to action items. Resolution 509-0616, approving the first supplement to the trust indenture dated July 2nd, 2015.
I think we should give Mr. Spikers the opportunity to make that motion, since it's difficult for him on the telephone there, if he wants to.
Would you like to make that motion, David?
I think I would, based on the conversations and the colloquy that we've went through at this point, it makes sense to me. So.
All right, so do you make a motion that we approve?
Yes.
Okay.
Second.
All those, is there any discussion, any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. David?
Yeah, aye.
All those that oppose, it's unanimous.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very
next
much.
scheduled-
I will go ahead and sign it whenever you want, Val.
Okay. Okay, because I got to,
Let me know. Do I have to have original signatures?
Not for
I'm going
my,
to be out of town for a few days, so.
yeah, not for my purposes. The fact that I was here and witnessed the fact that you approved it is sufficient for us to move forward with the
Okay.
next step of
Yeah.
getting the bondholder approval.
okay.
Okay,
And then will you
great.
come back to us and let us know if there's any problem
Yes,
with that?
of course.
Okay.
All right.
Next scheduled public meeting is Facilities Committee, Monday, June 20th, 2016, 8:30 a.m., Snoqualmie Valley Hospital East-West Conference Room. Finance Committee, Thursday, June 30th, 2016, 11:30 a.m., Snoqualmie City Hall, Council Chambers. And then the regular business meeting will be Thursday, July 7th at Snoqualmie City Hall at 6:30. Is there any other business?
I move adjournment.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We have a
Okay.
third.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
David.
Thank you.